A waitress whispered, "Someone tampered with your cake." 30 minutes later, the billionaire froze. The most dangerous warnings are often spoken so quietly that almost nobody hears them. At exactly 7:42 p.m., the Grand Regency Ballroom shimmered beneath layers of crystal chandeliers. Soft golden light reflected across polished marble floors. A string quartet played near the stage while servers moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Investors, politicians, journalists, business leaders. Every seat had been reserved weeks in advance for one reason. Richard Sterling was celebrating the largest acquisition of his career. At 46 years old, Richard had become one of the most recognized billionaires in America. Tonight was supposed to be flawless. Every detail had been planned. Every vendor had been approved. Every delivery had been verified. At least that was what everyone believed. Near the ballroom entrance, Claire Bennett adjusted the black apron tied neatly around her waist and watched another server roll a massive three-tier cake toward the center stage. The cake was beautiful. White frosting, gold accents, fresh flowers carefully arranged around each layer. Guests immediately reached for their phones. Cameras flashed. Applause spread across the ballroom. Yet Claire did not smile. Something about the cake felt wrong. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She glanced toward the delivery cart, then toward the transportation tag still attached to one corner of the cake stand, then toward the floral decorations. One detail caught her attention, then another, then a third. Tiny things. The kind of things most people never noticed. Claire had spent years noticing things. Before life forced her to leave college, she had studied food safety and quality control. Even now, years later, her mind still worked the same way. Patterns mattered. Small inconsistencies mattered. Details mattered. And right now, too many details refused to fit together. Across the ballroom, Richard Sterling shook hands with investors and accepted congratulations. He looked relaxed, confident, completely unaware that a waitress standing near the back of the room was staring at the centerpiece of his celebration with growing concern. Claire looked up at the giant clock mounted above the ballroom doors. 7:43. Then she looked back at the cake. The floral arrangement was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Subtly wrong. The security seal near the base appeared different from the one she remembered seeing earlier that afternoon. Even the delivery timestamp seemed unusual. None of those details proved anything. Yet together they created a feeling she could not ignore. Her heartbeat slowed. Not from fear. From focus. The room continued celebrating. The music continued. Guests laughed. Glasses clinked. Richard moved toward the stage where the cake waited beneath a spotlight. The event coordinator handed him a silver cake knife. More cameras appeared. The crowd gathered closer. Claire looked once more at the giant clock, then at Richard, then at the cake. Something had happened to it. She could feel it. Before doubt could stop her, Claire crossed the ballroom floor. Guests stepped aside as she moved toward the billionaire. Richard barely noticed her approach until she stopped beside him. The crowd remained focused on the ceremony. The music softened. Claire leaned slightly closer, speaking quietly enough that only he could hear. Her voice remained calm, respectful, certain. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered. Richard turned toward her. Claire took a breath. Then she delivered the sentence that would change the entire night. "Someone tampered with your cake." For a brief moment, Richard Sterling forgot about the cameras. He forgot about the investors waiting near the stage. He forgot about the applause that had filled the ballroom only seconds earlier. His attention narrowed entirely to the waitress standing beside him. Claire Bennett did not look frightened. She did not look dramatic. She simply looked certain. That was what unsettled him. Most people became emotional when making serious accusations. Claire remained calm. "What did you just say?" Richard asked quietly. The crowd was still watching the ceremony, unaware of the conversation taking place a few feet away. Claire glanced toward the cake before answering. "Someone tampered with it." Richard studied her face. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no sign that she was seeking attention. Yet the statement itself sounded impossible. Every delivery for the event had passed through multiple checkpoints. Security teams had reviewed vendor lists. Event coordinators had verified every supplier. Nothing about tonight was supposed to be left to chance. "How do you know?" Richard asked. Claire looked toward the giant clock above the ballroom entrance. 7:44. Then back toward the cake. "I do not know exactly what happened," she admitted. "But I know something is wrong. Around them, Guests continued smiling and taking photographs. The string quartet played softly beneath the chandeliers. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Richard followed her gaze toward the cake. White frosting, gold trim, fresh flowers. It looked exactly as a celebration cake should. "You are making a serious claim," he said. "I understand. Then tell me what you saw." Claire took a slow breath. "Several things." Richard waited. "The floral arrangement is different from the one shown on the delivery preview this afternoon." Richard frowned slightly. Claire continued. "The transport seal near the base was replaced. Not professionally, just enough to avoid attention." Richard looked back toward the cake. "Anything else?" Claire nodded. "The delivery timestamp does not match the receiving schedule." Richard glanced toward the ballroom floor. Those details sounded insignificant. Yet something about the way she presented them prevented him from dismissing them entirely. She was not guessing. She was observing. Across the room, the event coordinator signaled that the ceremony was ready to begin. Guests moved closer to the stage. Photographers prepared their cameras. The moment everyone had been waiting for was only seconds away. Richard looked back at Claire. "Who are you?" The question caught her off guard. "A waitress." "That is not what I meant." Claire hesitated. Then she answered honestly. "Before I worked here, I studied food safety and quality control." Richard raised an eyebrow. That explained part of it. Suddenly the details sounded less random, less speculative. Still, they were only details, not proof. 7:45. The second hand on the giant clock continued moving forward. Claire noticed it immediately. Richard noticed her noticing it. "You really believe something happened to that cake?" he asked. "Yes." "How certain are you?" Claire held his gaze. "Certain enough to walk across a ballroom full of people and risk being wrong." The answer lingered between them. For the first time that evening, Richard felt a small crack appear in his confidence. Not because he fully believed her, because he could not completely ignore her. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet countdown had already begun. 7:46. 3 minutes had passed since Claire Bennett whispered her warning. 27 remained. Richard Sterling stood beside the massive cake while the ballroom waited for him to begin the ceremonial first cut. The silver knife rested lightly in his hand. Around him, investors smiled. Reporters adjusted their cameras. The event coordinator signaled for the photographers to move closer. Everything was ready. Everything looked perfect. Yet Richard's attention kept drifting back to the waitress standing quietly a few feet away. Most people in the room had never noticed Claire before tonight. She was simply part of the background. Another employee moving between tables. Another person making sure the evening ran smoothly. Richard realized he knew nothing about her. Yet somehow she had managed to interrupt one of the most important moments of his year with a single sentence. "Someone tampered with your cake." The words refused to leave his mind. Across the ballroom, Claire remained still. She was not trying to convince anyone anymore. She had already delivered her warning. Now she watched. The giant clock above the ballroom entrance read 7:46. Its second hand continued moving with quiet precision. Tick, tick, tick. Claire's eyes shifted toward the cake again. Then toward the transport paperwork resting on a nearby service station. Then back to the cake. Something still felt wrong. Richard noticed her gaze. "You really believe this?" he asked quietly. Claire nodded once. "Yes, sir." Richard looked at the crowd gathering around the stage. Hundreds of people had traveled across the country for this event. Delaying the ceremony because of a suspicion seemed unreasonable. Yet proceeding without asking more questions suddenly felt reckless. For most of his life, Richard had trusted systems. Systems built companies. Systems protected investments. Systems reduced mistakes. That belief had helped him build a fortune. But systems were created by people. And people occasionally overlooked things. 7:47. 4 minutes gone. 26 remained. The event coordinator approached with a professional smile. "Mr. Sterling, we are ready whenever you are." Richard hesitated. The hesitation lasted only a second, but Claire noticed it immediately. Everyone else seemed focused on the celebration. Claire focused on details. Richard looked at the cake once more, then at the coordinator. "Can you bring me the delivery records?" The coordinator blinked in surprise. "The delivery records?" "Yes." "Now." Richard nodded. The coordinator looked confused but complied. Several nearby executives exchanged puzzled glances. Cameras continued flashing. The crowd assumed the delay was part of the ceremony. Nobody suspected otherwise. Claire watched the coordinator disappear toward the service corridor. For the first time all evening, she felt a small sense of relief. Not because Richard believed her completely, because he was finally asking questions. 7:48. 5 minutes gone. 25 remained. A few minutes later, the coordinator returned carrying a tablet and several printed documents. Richard accepted them and began reviewing the records. At first, everything appeared normal. Vendor information, delivery times, verification signatures, standard procedures. Then his eyes paused on a timestamp. He frowned. Claire saw it happen. The coordinator noticed it too. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Richard looked at the document again. The receiving time listed on one record did not match the confirmation time listed on another. It was only a few minutes apart. Easy to ignore. Easy to miss. Yet suddenly the discrepancy felt important. Richard slowly looked up toward Claire. She did not say a word. She simply held his gaze. And for the first time that evening, the billionaire began to wonder whether the quiet waitress might be seeing something everyone else had missed. 7:49. 6 minutes gone. 24 remained. The ballroom continued glowing beneath the crystal chandeliers while guests waited patiently for the celebration to resume. Most assumed the delay was a minor logistical issue. A microphone adjustment. A schedule change. Nothing unusual. Only a handful of people near the stage realized something else was happening. Richard Sterling lowered the delivery records and looked at the event coordinator. "Where did this discrepancy come from?" he asked quietly. The coordinator leaned closer and examined the timestamps. Her confident expression faded. "That is strange." Richard handed her the document. "The receiving time and confirmation time do not match." The coordinator reviewed the paperwork again. Then a second time. "I do not remember seeing that earlier." Claire Bennett remained silent nearby. She was not trying to prove herself right. She was simply watching the pieces move into place. The giant clock above the ballroom entrance read 7:49. Tick, tick, tick. Richard turned another page. Then another. Most records appeared normal. Yet the deeper he looked, the more inconsistencies emerged. Small details, easy to overlook individually, difficult to ignore together. One verification signature looked slightly different from the others. A delivery reference number appeared incomplete. Even the routing information seemed unusually vague. The coordinator looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Let me contact the vendor directly," she said. Richard nodded. "Do it." As she stepped away, Claire glanced toward the cake. The floral arrangement still bothered her. Earlier that afternoon, she had helped set up several displays near the ballroom. She distinctly remembered seeing white orchids in the vendor preview photographs. The cake now displayed cream-colored lilies. Beautiful flowers. Expensive flowers. But not the flowers that had originally been approved. 7:51. 8 minutes gone. 22 remained. Richard noticed Claire studying the cake again. "The flowers?" he asked. Claire looked at him. "They are different." Richard followed her gaze. "You are sure?" "Yes." Richard rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Could that simply be a substitution? Possibly. Claire paused. But substitutions usually appear in the paperwork. Richard glanced back at the documents in his hand. Nothing mentioned a substitution. Across the ballroom, the event coordinator returned with her phone pressed against her ear. Her expression had changed. She was no longer confused. Now she looked concerned. The call ended. She approached quickly. "The vendor has a problem," she said. Richard immediately looked up. "What kind of problem?" "They cannot verify who signed for the delivery transfer." Silence settled around the small group. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Another piece. Another inconsistency. Another missing answer. 7:53. 10 minutes gone. 20 remained. Nearby guests continued talking and laughing, completely unaware of the growing tension behind the scenes. The string quartet played a soft arrangement near the stage. Waiters carried trays of sparkling water and desserts. Everything still appeared normal from a distance. Yet beneath the surface, certainty was beginning to crack. Richard looked toward the giant cake standing beneath its spotlight. 20 minutes ago, it had represented success, celebration, achievement. Now it looked different. Not threatening, not dangerous, simply uncertain. And uncertainty was something Richard disliked. The billionaire built his entire career on reducing uncertainty. Yet tonight, a waitress had introduced it with a single whisper. The coordinator's phone vibrated again. She answered immediately. Claire watched her face carefully. Then she saw it. The subtle widening of the eyes. The sudden stillness. The realization. The coordinator slowly lowered the phone and looked directly at Richard. "Sir," she said quietly. "The vendor says one of the transfer records is completely missing." 7:54. 11 minutes gone. 19 remained. The words hung in the air between them. One transfer record was completely missing. Richard Sterling slowly lowered the documents in his hand. Around him, the celebration continued as if nothing had changed. Guests laughed beneath the crystal chandeliers. Glasses clinked. The string quartet moved gracefully through another song. Yet for the small group gathered near the stage, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Claire Bennett watched the event coordinator carefully. She could tell from her expression that the problem was larger than a simple paperwork error. Missing records did not appear by accident, especially not in events that involved multiple layers of verification. Richard looked toward the giant clock above the ballroom entrance. 7:54. Then back toward the coordinator. "How does a transfer record disappear?" he asked. The coordinator shook her head. "It should not." Claire glanced at the cake. The white frosting reflected the ballroom lights. The gold decorations sparkled beneath the spotlight. To everyone else, it remained the centerpiece of a perfect evening. To Claire, it had become a question waiting for an answer. "Who handled the transfer?" Richard asked. The coordinator checked her phone again. "The vendor is trying to verify that now." Richard nodded slowly. He was beginning to feel something unfamiliar. Not fear. Uncertainty. For years he had built companies by identifying weak points in complex systems. He knew that small failures often revealed larger problems hidden underneath. And tonight, too many small failures were appearing at once. 7:56. 13 minutes gone. 17 remained. Claire quietly stepped toward the service station where additional delivery documents had been placed. She picked up a printed routing sheet and examined it beneath the light. Her eyes moved line by line. Date, time, driver identification, vehicle information. Then she stopped. Her gaze narrowed. Richard noticed immediately. "What is it?" Claire looked up. "This driver identification number." Richard moved closer. "What about it?" Claire pointed to the page. "It has one digit too many." The coordinator stared at the document. "You are right." Richard frowned. The difference was small, almost invisible, exactly the kind of mistake most people would overlook. Claire handed the paper to the coordinator. "Can you verify it?" The coordinator immediately stepped away to make another call. Richard watched her go. Then he looked at Claire. "How do you keep seeing these things?" Claire gave a small shrug. "I look for what does not belong." The answer sounded simple. Yet Richard realized how rare that skill actually was. Most people focused on what was present. Claire focused on what was out of place. 7:58. 15 minutes gone. 15 remained. The giant clock continued its silent countdown. Half the time had already passed. Across the ballroom, several investors approached Richard, asking when the ceremony would begin. He offered polite answers and promised it would start shortly. They returned to their conversations, unaware that the evening had quietly become an investigation. Moments later, the coordinator returned. Her pace was faster now, her expression more serious. She stopped beside Richard and took a breath. "The driver identification number does not exist." Silence followed. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Another piece. Another confirmation. Another detail connecting itself to the pattern she had noticed from the beginning. Richard looked toward the cake once more. The spotlight still illuminated it beautifully. Yet now, for the first time, the billionaire no longer saw a celebration cake. He saw a mystery. And somewhere inside that mystery was the reason a waitress had crossed an entire ballroom to whisper a warning that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. 7:59. 16 minutes gone. 14 remained. The ballroom still looked magnificent. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across hundreds of guests. A soft melody drifted through the room. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays. To anyone standing more than 20 feet away, the evening appeared flawless. Yet beneath the surface, certainty was disappearing one detail at a time. Richard Sterling stood near the stage with the delivery documents still in his hands. The non-existent driver identification number had changed everything. What began as a waitress's suspicion was becoming a documented chain of inconsistencies. Missing records, mismatched timestamps, unverified transfers, altered details. Richard glanced toward the giant clock above the ballroom entrance. 7:59. The second hand continued moving steadily forward. Claire Bennett remained composed. Her black apron was still neatly tied. Her posture remained calm. Yet her attention never drifted far from the cake. She noticed everything. The spotlight reflecting off the gold decorations. The untouched knife resting beside the cake stand. The small transportation label partially hidden near the base. Every detail mattered. The event coordinator's phone rang again. She answered immediately and stepped several feet away to hear better. Richard watched her expression carefully. Experience had taught him how to read people. Whatever she was hearing, it was not good news. Around them, a few executives began whispering among themselves. They sensed the tension now. Not the cause, just the tension. 8 o'clock. 17 minutes gone. 13 remained. The coordinator returned carrying a tablet. The vendor found something else, she said quietly. Richard looked up. What? She turned the screen toward him. A digital transfer log appeared. Several names were listed. Several signatures. Then a blank space. This is where the chain stops, she explained. Richard studied the screen. One section of the transportation history had no verified handoff. No confirmation. No employee record. Nothing. The gap lasted nearly 40 minutes. Silence settled between them. Claire looked at the screen. 40 minutes. More than enough time for someone to access the shipment without being recorded. Richard slowly exhaled. The pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. Can they verify where the cake was during that period? He asked. The coordinator shook her head. Not yet. Claire looked toward the cake again. Then something caught her eye. Near the base of the stand, partially concealed beneath decorative fabric, sat a small adhesive label. Tiny. Almost invisible. She stepped closer. Richard noticed immediately. What is it? Claire crouched slightly and examined the label. The printing was faded, but still readable. Her eyes narrowed. This label belongs to a different distribution center. Richard moved beside her. Different from what? Different from the one listed on the paperwork. The coordinator leaned closer. Her expression tightened. Another discrepancy. Another piece that did not fit. 8:03. 20 minutes gone. 10 remained. The countdown was entering its final third. Guests were beginning to notice the delay. Conversation slowed. Curious glances drifted toward the stage. The celebration had quietly transformed into something else. Richard looked at Claire for several seconds. 20 minutes earlier, she had been a stranger carrying a serving tray. Now she was the person uncovering answers faster than the systems he trusted. The billionaire turned back toward the cake. For the first time all evening, he no longer wondered whether Claire might be right. He was beginning to wonder how much worse the truth might be. 8:04. 21 minutes gone. 9 remained. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a room holding its breath. Guests still occupied their seats beneath the chandeliers, but conversations had become quieter. Curious glances drifted toward the stage. The delay had stretched long enough that people sensed something unusual was happening. Richard Sterling stood beside the untouched cake, staring at the small adhesive label Claire Bennett had discovered near the base of the stand. A different distribution center. Another inconsistency. Another piece that should not exist. The billionaire looked toward the giant clock above the ballroom entrance. 8:04. 9 minutes remained before the 30-minute mark that had quietly settled into his thoughts. Across from him, Claire remained composed. Her expression had not changed since the moment she delivered her warning. She was not excited, not triumphant. If anything, she seemed more concerned now than before. The event coordinator's phone rang again. She answered immediately. This time she placed the call on speaker. A representative from the vendor spoke through the device. We completed the review of the transportation chain. Richard straightened slightly. Several nearby executives leaned closer. The representative continued. We can confirm there was an unverified access window during the transfer process. Silence followed. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. Another confirmation. Another missing piece suddenly falling into place. Richard spoke carefully. Can you explain what that means? The voice answered. For approximately 38 minutes, the shipment was outside documented supervision. The words seemed to echo through the small circle gathered around the stage. 38 minutes. More than enough time for someone to alter records. More than enough time for someone to replace materials. More than enough time for someone to tamper with a shipment. The representative continued. We are still investigating how it happened. Richard thanked the caller and ended the conversation. Nobody spoke for several seconds. 8:06. 23 minutes gone. 7 remained. The giant clock continued its relentless movement. Tick, tick, tick. Across the ballroom, a reporter quietly lowered her camera. Several investors exchanged concerned looks. The event coordinator contacted hotel security and requested additional verification records. Meanwhile, Claire's attention returned to the cake. Something still bothered her. She slowly walked around the display table, studying it from another angle. Then she noticed something almost invisible beneath one layer of decorative ribbon. A small section of packaging tape. Different color. Different texture. She stopped immediately. Richard saw her reaction. What is it now? Claire carefully pointed toward the ribbon. That should not be there. Richard stepped closer. So did the coordinator. The tape appeared ordinary. Yet after everything else they had discovered, ordinary no longer felt ordinary. The coordinator photographed it immediately. 8:08. 25 minutes gone. 5 remained. A security supervisor approached carrying a tablet. We found something in the loading dock footage, he said. Richard looked up sharply. The supervisor opened the video and replayed a short segment. A delivery vehicle appeared, then disappeared from view. Nothing unusual at first. Then another frame appeared. The timestamp jumped forward unexpectedly. Several minutes of footage were missing. Richard stared at the screen. Claire stared at the screen. The coordinator covered her mouth. Another gap. Another missing record. Another unexplained absence. Richard slowly looked toward Claire. 25 minutes earlier, he had nearly dismissed her warning. Now every new piece of evidence seemed to point in the same direction. The quiet waitress had seen the truth long before anyone else. And somewhere in the final 5 minutes of the countdown, the answer they had been searching for was finally beginning to emerge. 8:09. 26 minutes gone. 4 remained. The ballroom had grown noticeably quieter. Not because anyone had made an announcement. Because uncertainty had spread through the room like a silent current. Guests sensed that something significant was unfolding near the stage. Conversations softened. Reporters watched more carefully. Even the musicians seemed to play more gently. Richard Sterling stood beside the untouched cake, his attention fixed on the security tablet. Missing footage. Missing records. Missing verification. Every answer seemed to uncover another question. Yet all of those questions pointed toward the same conclusion. Claire Bennett had been right to speak up. The security supervisor continued reviewing the loading dock recordings. Several additional camera angles appeared on the screen. Then one of them stopped. Richard frowned. Pause that. The supervisor froze the image. A delivery cart sat partially visible near a service entrance. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then Claire stepped closer. Her eyes narrowed. Zoom in. The supervisor enlarged the image. The picture became grainy, but one detail remained visible. The original security seal attached to the cake container looked different from the seal documented in the arrival photographs. The room fell silent. Richard stared at the screen. The coordinator stared at the screen. Nobody spoke. They did not need to. The evidence was beginning to speak for itself. 8:10. 27 minutes gone. 3 remained. The coordinator's phone rang once again. She answered immediately. This time the call came from the bakery itself. Everyone listened. The manager on the line sounded exhausted. We completed our internal audit. Richard stepped closer. What did you find? A brief pause followed. Then the answer came. The cake that arrived at your event was not the same cake that left our facility. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The words seemed impossible and obvious at the same time. Claire lowered her eyes. Richard looked toward the giant clock above the ballroom entrance. 3 minutes remained. The bakery manager continued speaking. The original shipment photographs do not match the decorations on the cake currently at your venue. We can confirm substitutions occurred after departure. The coordinator covered her mouth. The security supervisor looked stunned. Several nearby executives exchanged disbelieving glances. Richard slowly turned toward Claire. 27 minutes earlier, she had whispered a warning that sounded impossible. Now every piece of evidence was aligning behind it. 8:11. 28 minutes gone. 2 remained. Across the ballroom, word began spreading. Guests noticed the serious expressions. Reporters lowered their cameras and listened. Hotel staff stopped moving. The celebration had completely transformed into something else. Richard walked toward the giant cake and stared at it beneath the spotlight. White frosting, gold trim, fresh flowers. Beautiful, elegant, entirely untrustworthy. He realized that if Claire had remained silent, he would never have questioned it. Not once. Because he trusted appearances. Claire trusted details. And details were winning. 8:12. 29 minutes gone. One remained. The bakery manager sent the final verification package. Security records. Original photographs. Transportation logs. The coordinator opened the files immediately. Richard watched her expression change. Confusion disappeared. Doubt disappeared. What remained was certainty. Absolute certainty. She slowly raised her eyes from the screen and looked directly at him. The answer had finally arrived. The final missing piece was now sitting in her hands. And as the giant clock approached the 30-minute mark, the entire ballroom waited for the truth. 8:13. 30 minutes. Exactly 30 minutes after Claire Bennett crossed the ballroom and whispered her warning, Richard Sterling froze. The giant clock above the entrance seemed to stop with him. Around the room, hundreds of guests watched in complete silence. The event coordinator stood beside him holding the final verification package from the bakery. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the report aloud. The original shipment photographs showed a different cake, different floral arrangements, different security seals, different packaging identifiers. The evidence was undeniable. Somewhere between the bakery and the ballroom, the cake had been altered. Nobody yet knew why. Nobody yet knew by whom. But one fact had become impossible to dispute. Claire had been right from the very beginning. Richard stared at the photographs displayed on the tablet, then at the cake beneath the spotlight, then at Claire. The waitress who had spoken only one sentence 30 minutes earlier had seen what an entire network of managers, vendors, coordinators, and security procedures had missed. Across the ballroom, conversations disappeared completely. Reporters lowered their cameras. Investors exchanged stunned looks. The room that had gathered to celebrate a billionaire was now looking at a waitress. Richard slowly set the silver cake knife on the table. The small sound echoed through the silence. Then he stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. His voice carried easily across the ballroom. Every eye turned toward him. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of success. He paused. Instead, it became a lesson. Richard looked directly at Claire. 30 minutes ago, a waitress approached me and warned me that something was wrong. He glanced around the room. I almost ignored her. The admission surprised many people. Richard Sterling was not known for public vulnerability. Yet he continued. The truth is that she saw details the rest of us missed. She noticed inconsistencies. She asked questions. She paid attention when nobody else did. Claire felt dozens of eyes turned toward her. She lowered her gaze, uncomfortable with the attention. Richard smiled slightly. The smartest observation made tonight did not come from a boardroom. It did not come from a consultant. It did not come from an executive. He gestured toward Claire. It came from her. Applause began slowly, then spread throughout the ballroom. Not loud celebration. Not excitement. Respect. Genuine respect. Claire stood quietly in her black apron as hundreds of people applauded. Richard walked over and extended his hand. Claire hesitated only briefly before shaking it. Cameras flashed, yet neither seemed to notice. 1 week later, a cream-colored envelope arrived at the hotel addressed to Claire Bennett. Inside was a handwritten letter from Richard Sterling and a full scholarship to complete the food safety degree she had been forced to leave years earlier. At the bottom of the letter, one sentence stood alone. You saw what everyone else missed. Sitting beneath flowering trees in the hotel courtyard, Claire read those words twice. Then she folded the letter carefully and looked toward the future she thought she had lost. Across the city, Richard stood in his office overlooking the skyline, thinking about a lesson no business school had ever taught him. Systems mattered. Procedures mattered. Success mattered. But sometimes the most valuable truth in the room belonged to the person nobody was paying attention to. And on one unforgettable night beneath crystal chandeliers, a quiet waitress proved that the people who notice the smallest details often protect what everyone else values most.